But what I find fairly troubling about this story, in addition to David's gratuitous sins, what I find so troubling is the tactics God has to use through Nathan to expose the truth. God essentially tricks David into seeing his own sin. David is so far gone in his own self-delusion that God has to fool him into admitting that he was wrong. Unless we think this is an isolated incident for God, we should remember that Jesus does this from time to time. In the Gospels, people are continually trying to trap Jesus, and Jesus responds by trapping them back. Familiar lines you might know, such as "Render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, and render unto God what is God's." Lines like "Let you who are without sin cast the first stone." These responses of Jesus are not only full of wisdom and truth. In the context, they're also full of sass and bite that surprised Jesus' audience into a confused and convicted silence. So what does that mean that God has to resort to this kind of rhetoric for us? God essentially has to use some popular internet parlance, has to troll us in order for us to see the truth. And lest we take this as a license to start troll people on Facebook or engage in any kind of ideological one-upsmanship on Twitter, let me suggest that we simply consider what God's misdirective tactics reveals about who we are. I think these tactics reveal that convincing people that what they're doing is wrong and that they need to stop doing it is really, really hard. It took Nathan tricking David into pronouncing his own death sentence for him to register the painful reality of his own sin. And adultery and murder are not subtle sins. So how is it? How is it that God's anointed king couldn't figure out that what he had done deserved death before this dramatic moment? I've often been told that the story of David and Bathsheba is a story about the power of lust. But I think in light of these questions, I think it must really be a story about the power of self-delusion. It's about how easily we can convince ourselves that the obviously bad things we've done are just fine or justifiable enough that they ought to be ignored. Of course, David probably knew on some level that he had done something wrong. You usually don't resort to murder to cover up something you actually thought was okay. Lying, hiding, covering up. These are all acts that are generated by shame. See, shame happens when we see something in ourselves that we want to hide from the world. Shame happens when we want the world or God to overlook something we think is wrong. And I want to be clear that not all shame we experience has its roots in things we've actually done wrong. Sometimes it's just things that the world is telling us we've done wrong. But shame nearly every time, no matter its source, makes us want to hide. I can tell you that the number of times I've experienced shame and have not wanted to hide is exactly 0 times. 0 times. And lying, in the way that we see David do here, lying makes that kind of shame-ridden hiding easier. It's like painting over the wallpaper instead of stripping it off. It makes it easier, just covering it up. And if you've ever lied, which if you're keeping score is all of us, if you've ever lied, you know this, you know how easy it is. And keep in mind that David's actions here in this story left him with a kind of plausible deniability. He didn't physically kill Uriah. He wasn't even there. And we, like David, live in a world where it's easy to separate ourselves from the consequences of our actions. And we, like David, are often the most zealous evangelists for our own good intentions. Because it's easier to not see the truth. It's easier to not peer down the chain of consequences to what our actions turn into. It's easier to stay in the darkness where our hatred and myopia can hide. It's easier to stay in the darkness because in the dark we can fall asleep. We can fall asleep and we can ignore the pain we may have caused.